Alejandro Mendoza, Spain's richest multi-billionaire heir, had it all: money, power, and a supermodel girlfriend who seemed perfect. But he had one nagging doubt: was Isabella's love genuine, or was it all about his wealth? So he came up with an extreme plan that would shock everyone. With the help of his personal physician, he faked a devastating accident that left him paralyzed from the waist down. He wanted to see how Isabella would react when he was in a wheelchair, dependent on others, stripped of the glamour of power. What happened in the days that followed left him stunned. While Isabella revealed her true colors, someone else in the mansion, someone he'd always treated as invisible, showed a love so pure and selfless that it changed his entire outlook on life. Who was this mysterious person who truly loved him for who he was? And how would she react when she discovered it had all been an act? Alejandro Mendoza sat in his panoramic office on the 40th floor of the skyscraper that bore his name, right in the heart of Madrid, gazing out over the city that stretched beneath him like a kingdom he ruled without question. At 29, he had inherited the Mendoza family financial empire and tripled it in 5 years, becoming Spain's richest man under 30. He had everything money could buy. A €50 million mansion in La Moraleja, a collection of sports cars, yachts, private jets, homes in every major European capital, and above all, Isabella Ruiz, Spain's most photographed model. They'd been together for 2 years, and the media called them the country's most beautiful couple. Yet on that September afternoon, Alejandro felt empty. For months, one thought had been tormenting him: did Isabella truly love him, or was she just drawn to his fortune and influence? The signs were subtle but unmistakable. The way her eyes lit up when he gave her expensive jewelry, but she grew distant during deep conversations. How she vanished on his tough workdays, only to reappear magically for social events. The fact that she never showed interest in his thoughts, doubts, or fears. Alejandro had observed it all with the same sharp analytical mind he used in business, and the conclusion was bitter. He was in love with a woman who saw him as nothing more than a luxury ATM. That afternoon, a crazy idea started forming. If Isabella truly loved him, she'd love him even when he was no longer the powerful Alejandro Mendoza everyone admired. He called Dr. Carlos Herrera, his personal physician and one of his few real friends. When Herrera arrived, Alejandro laid out the most extreme plan of his life: fake paralysis to test Isabella's love. The doctor was speechless, convinced he'd misheard. But seeing the determination mixed with vulnerability in his childhood friend's eyes, he started taking it seriously. Alejandro explained he wanted to see how Isabella would react to him in a wheelchair, dependent on others, without the allure of success. Technically, it was doable. Herrera could forge medical reports, claim a car accident had caused spinal cord damage with some hope of recovery. That night, Alejandro didn't sleep, watching Isabella sleep peacefully, unaware of what was coming. The next day, everything was arranged down to the smallest detail. Herrera prepared fake medical documents, briefed trusted nurses, and had credible medical equipment installed in the mansion. Alejandro called Isabella, who was in Barcelona for a photo shoot, and broke the news of a terrible accident that had left him paralyzed. Her reaction was exactly what he expected. Shock, disbelief, promises to rush back. But Alejandro, with the ear of someone who read people in business deals, caught a pause that was too long before her comforting words, a hesitation that chilled him. When Isabella arrived at the mansion that night, Alejandro was already in character, sitting in the wheelchair, waiting for the moment of truth. The sound of her Maserati on the gravel driveway made his heart pound harder than any multimillion-dollar negotiation. As he heard her heels approaching the door, he had no idea the real surprise wouldn't come from Isabella, but from someone else who lived under the same roof, someone he'd always considered practically invisible. Isabella swept into the mansion like a star walking the red carpet. Despite the dramatic circumstances, her Louboutin heels clicked on the marble as she approached Alejandro in the wheelchair. She wore a fiery red Armani suit, her hair perfectly styled despite the urgent trip, makeup flawless. A truly worried woman wouldn't have prepped like she was heading to a photo shoot. She threw herself at his feet with theatrical flair, but Alejandro noticed she was careful not to ruin her dress. When he explained the doctors were talking months or years for recovery, with the chance he might never fully heal, he caught a shadow cross her eyes, a flash of disappointment so quick he almost missed it. Her words sounded hollow, automatic. She avoided his gaze, her eyes wandering around the room as if her mind was already elsewhere. When Alejandro mentioned he'd need assistance for months, Isabella quickly said she'd help, then immediately started listing her pre-booked work commitments. Less than 24 hours after hearing about the accident, she was already explaining why she couldn't be there for him: the shoot with Zara, the campaign in Ibiza, the fashion show in Milan. As Isabella spoke, Alejandro heard a quiet noise from the next room. It was Carmen Lopez, the Galician housekeeper who had worked in the mansion for 3 years. A 32-year-old woman, always quiet and efficient, average height, brown hair always tied back, simple practical clothes. She blended into the background. Carmen entered with a tea tray, and Alejandro really looked at her for the first time in years. There was something in her dark eyes, genuine concern that stood in sharp contrast to Isabella's attitude. She adjusted a cushion behind his back with careful, natural gestures. Isabella watched impatiently, then excused herself to make urgent calls to her agent. She left the room trailing expensive perfume and a sense of emptiness. Carmen stayed, quietly tidying. Alejandro asked her to sit for a moment. He admitted he needed company. For the first time in 3 years, they talked like human beings instead of employer and employee. Carmen sat beside him naturally, listening as Alejandro complained about feeling pathetic. She said she didn't think that at all. He was going through an incredibly tough time and needed people who truly cared about him. Those words hit Alejandro harder than any declaration of love from Isabella. There was a sincerity in Carmen he'd never noticed, an ability to see past the surface that moved him deeply. The next night, Isabella slept in the guest room so she wouldn't disturb him. Alejandro lay awake, realizing his plan was already yielding unexpected results. Isabella had shown her true colors in under 24 hours: superficial, self-interested, incapable of affection when things got hard. But the real revelation was Carmen. In just hours of his fake disability, this quiet woman had shown more care and humanity than Isabella ever had. The next day, Isabella left for Milan as planned, barely hiding her relief at escaping the uncomfortable situation. Alejandro watched her drive off in the Maserati and, for the first time in 2 years, felt no pain at seeing her go. What he didn't know was that Carmen, from the kitchen window, was watching the same scene with an expression of sadness and indignation that would have surprised anyone who noticed. The days after Isabella's departure revealed a reality Alejandro had never seen. While Isabella sent sporadic texts with excuses to extend her absence, Carmen became his constant, quiet, indispensable presence. Every morning at 7, she brought breakfast prepared exactly how he liked it. Scrambled eggs, double espresso, warm toast, fresh orange juice. But it was how she did it that touched him: gentle, natural gestures, no air of sacrifice or duty. Her hands were rough from work, yet her movements were incredibly tender. She helped without making him feel inadequate. She spoke to him without pity. She treated him as a whole person despite his apparent condition. One day, Alejandro asked why she'd come to Madrid. Carmen hesitated, then shared that her younger sister had needed expensive heart surgery. Waiting lists in Galicia were too long, so she'd moved to Madrid where domestic work paid better. The surgery had been successful 2 years earlier, and now Lucia was studying medicine in Santiago to become a cardiothoracic surgeon. Alejandro felt something tighten in his chest. This woman had sacrificed everything to save her sister, leaving her home, her family, caring for a wealthy stranger. And he'd never noticed. In the days that followed, Alejandro started noticing things about Carmen that had always been there: how she softly sang in Galician while cleaning, how she read literature on her breaks, how she spoke 3 languages fluently and had a degree in philology she'd never mentioned. On the 5th day, when Alejandro pretended to have back pain, Carmen didn't hesitate to sleep in the armchair in his room to help if needed. She barely slept, getting up every hour to check on him, adjusting blankets, bringing water without being asked. Around 3 a.m., thinking he was asleep, Carmen gently brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. Then she whispered so softly he barely heard, "Please get better soon. I can't stand seeing you like this." In that sentence was such genuine pain, such pure affection, that Alejandro had to clench his jaw to stay still. Carmen loved him. Not his money, not his status, but him, even when he was broken and dependent. The next morning, when she brought breakfast with her usual smile, Alejandro looked at her with completely new eyes. This woman had spent 3 years caring for him with devotion that went far beyond her job. When he asked what she'd do if he never recovered, Carmen met his gaze with surprising intensity. She said he was already perfect as he was, that disability didn't define a person. He was still Alejandro Mendoza, intelligent, kind, able to make people laugh, generous. His legs had nothing to do with who he really was. And when he asked if she'd stay if he needed help forever, she answered without hesitation, "Then I'd be here forever." In that moment, Alejandro realized he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, not just true love, but a person who saw him for who he truly was and loved him for it. But what he didn't know was that Carmen had started to suspect something, and when the truth came out, it would bring consequences neither of them could imagine. Carmen Lopez was no fool. She had a degree in philology, spoke 4 languages, and above all had that female intuition that caught details others missed. Certain things about Alejandro's accident didn't add up. First, he was too fit for someone who'd suffered major spinal trauma, no muscle atrophy in his legs. Second, his reflexes were perfect, he instinctively moved his feet when something might bump them while she cleaned. Third, she'd seen his toes twitch while he slept. But the clincher was finding medical documents carelessly left on his desk while cleaning his study. Carmen had helped care for her sister during her illness and knew medical terminology. Those reports were too generic, like they'd been written by someone who wasn't a spinal trauma specialist. On the 7th night, Carmen made a decision. She waited until Alejandro was asleep, then went down to his study. She knew the combination to the safe behind the Velázquez painting, his mother's birthday. What she found took her breath away: a contract with Dr. Herrera for unconventional medical consulting, emails between Alejandro and the doctor discussing a convincing staged scenario and behavioral test, receipts for rented wheelchair and fake medical equipment. Carmen sat trembling in the armchair, documents in hand, feeling her world collapse. It was all fake, the accident, the paralysis, her suffering. He'd orchestrated it to test Isabella. She'd just been collateral damage, an unwitting witness to a cruel experiment. The most humiliating part was that she'd fallen in love with him during that week of fake care. She'd stayed up nights worrying, prayed for his recovery, daydreamed about an impossible future. Tears fell silently as she read the final document, a plan for gradually revealing the truth to minimize relational damage. Alejandro had even planned how to manipulate her after deceiving her. Carmen put everything back, went to her room, packed her bags, left a formal resignation letter on the kitchen desk, grabbed her things, and called a taxi. It was 3 a.m. when she left the mansion for the last time, quietly closing the door. But Alejandro wasn't asleep. Guilt and his growing feelings for Carmen kept him awake. He heard the taxi leave, ran to the window just in time to see its lights disappear into the darkness. He found her room empty and the letter in the kitchen, a few formal lines of resignation that broke his heart. At 8 a.m., he called Dr. Herrera in panic. Carmen had discovered everything and left. He had to find her. Herrera said maybe it was for the best, the plan had gone too far. But Alejandro shouted that he didn't care anymore. He'd fallen in love with Carmen. This woman had loved him when she thought he was paralyzed, cared for him like he was the most important person in the world, and he'd repaid her with the cruelest lie possible. Finding Carmen Lopez in a city of 3 million people with no contacts proved harder than any financial deal Alejandro had ever faced. As days passed without news, he realized he'd lost the most precious thing he'd ever had. Just when he'd realized he couldn't live without it, Alejandro learned that being one of Spain's richest men meant nothing when the person you wanted to find had every reason to hide from you. Carmen had vanished from Madrid as if she'd never existed, and every day without her was torture. He immediately dropped the paralysis act and walked normally again, but ironically, he felt more paralyzed than before, paralyzed by remorse and fear of having lost the woman he loved forever. He hired 3 private investigation agencies, placed newspaper ads, checked budget hotels, but Carmen seemed to have evaporated. The only thing he learned was that she'd withdrawn her entire savings, 25,000 euros earned over 3 years. On the 5th day, he got a call that froze him. Isabella had returned from Milan, shocked to find him walking normally. Alejandro had completely forgotten about her. The woman he'd staged the whole charade for now seemed insignificant. When Isabella excitedly suggested going to Marbella as they'd planned before the accident, without even asking how his week of paralysis had been, Alejandro finally saw her superficiality clearly. He ended the relationship on the spot. That night, alone in his mansion, he had an idea. If he couldn't find Carmen directly, maybe through her sister Lucia, who was studying medicine in Santiago. He used his influence to get information from Galician universities. After 2 days, he located Lucia Lopez, 25, fifth-year medical student at the University of Santiago, specializing in pediatric cardiothoracic surgery. Without hesitation, he took his private jet to Santiago. He found Lucia in the university library, hunched over cardiac anatomy textbooks. The resemblance to Carmen was striking, same dark eyes, same delicate features. When he introduced himself as Carmen's former employer, Lucia's expression turned cold and guarded. She said Carmen wasn't angry with him, she was devastated. She'd cried for 3 days when she arrived in Santiago. She'd told Lucia everything, how he'd deceived and used her in his cruel games. Alejandro begged to know where Carmen was, saying he loved her. Lucia laughed bitterly. That was his idea of love? Making her fall for him while pretending to be paralyzed, playing with her feelings to test another woman? Alejandro sat down heavily, crushed by guilt. Lucia saw the sincerity of his pain. Then she told him that if he truly loved Carmen, he should leave her alone. Carmen deserved someone who wouldn't lie to her, manipulate her, or treat her with respect from the start. Alejandro admitted she was right, Carmen deserved far better than him. He only asked that she tell Carmen he was sorrier than words could express, and that if there were any way to undo what he'd done, he'd give everything for that chance. Alejandro returned to Madrid with an even heavier heart. Maybe the most loving thing was to let Carmen go, to allow her to rebuild her life away from the pain he'd caused. But what Alejandro didn't know was that Carmen, in her small Santiago boarding house, had heard every word of the message Lucia passed on, and those words had rekindled something she thought she'd buried forever. 2 weeks after Alejandro's return from Santiago, life in the La Moraleja mansion had become an emotional wasteland. Alejandro worked mechanically, barely ate, slept little. He'd fired all the staff and lived alone in the huge house that now felt like a gilded tomb. Every room reminded him of Carmen. The kitchen where she'd prepared meals with love, the living room where they'd had their first real conversations, his bedroom where she'd watched over him with endless devotion while he lied shamelessly. One gray November morning, the doorbell rang. A courier delivered an express package from Galicia, sender Lucia Lopez. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small item wrapped in tissue paper. The letter said Carmen was returning something that belonged to him and had something to tell him, but only if he'd truly changed. If he was interested, Carmen would be the next day at 3 p.m. in the Sabatini Gardens, at the spot where they'd first met. Alejandro unwrapped the item and his heart stopped. It was the small silver crucifix his mother had given him at 16, the only piece of jewelry with true sentimental value. During the week of fake paralysis, he must have lost it, and Carmen had found it. But Carmen said they'd first met in the Sabatini Gardens. Alejandro didn't remember ever meeting her there before she started working for him. The next day, he arrived at the gardens an hour early, too nervous to wait. At exactly 3 o'clock, he saw her approach. She wore a simple beige coat, her hair down for the first time since he'd known her, and she looked thinner. They stood at a distance, studying each other. Carmen gave a sad smile and began to explain. It had happened 3 years earlier. She'd just arrived from Galicia, barely spoke Castilian Spanish, and was job hunting. She'd seen the ad for the housekeeper position at his mansion but was terrified. She'd been sitting on that bench crying, unsure if she'd be good enough. Alejandro had jogged past, stopped, and asked if she was okay. She'd told him she was Galician, looking for work, scared. He'd handed her a handkerchief and said courage wasn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Then he'd offered to walk her to the interview, saying he'd put in a good word with the boss. He hadn't known he was the boss. Alejandro started to remember the Galician girl crying in the park, his impulse to help her. Carmen said she'd fallen in love with him that day, with the kind man who stopped to help a stranger. But when she started working for him, she'd seen him become different, cold, distant, focused only on money. She'd thought she'd been wrong about him. During the week of fake paralysis, she'd seen the man she'd fallen for 3 years earlier again, vulnerable, human, capable of real conversation. That's why discovering it was all fake had hurt even more. Alejandro stood from the bench and knelt before her on the damp grass. He solemnly promised never to lie to her again, to treat her like the queen she was, to love and respect her every day of his life. If she gave him one chance, he'd spend the rest of his days proving she deserved all the love in the world. Carmen looked at this powerful man humbling himself for her love and felt the wall of pain start to crumble. She told him to stand, people were staring. He said he didn't care about people, he only cared about her. She reached out to help him up. When their hands touched, they both felt the spark that had always been there. Carmen gave him one chance, just one. At the first lie, it would be over forever. Alejandro took her hands, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. One chance was all he needed, and he'd use it to prove true love existed. And that she deserved it more than anyone. They kissed in the Sabatini Gardens, the place they'd first met, as November sunlight painted everything golden. For the first time in his life, Alejandro understood that true wealth isn't measured in money or possessions, but in the ability to love and be loved authentically. 2 years later, they married in those same gardens, with 200 guests including Lucia, now an established cardiothoracic surgeon, and all the mansion staff. Carmen had kept her simplicity and kindness. Alejandro had learned to be the man she'd always seen in him, generous, human, capable of unconditional love. Every Sunday on their walks, when they passed that bench, they stopped to thank fate. A love born from kindness, grown in truth, blossomed in the second chance we all deserve when love is real.